What makes the Cambodia scam crackdown so unsettling is that it does not look, at first, like one of the biggest criminal stories in the world. It sounds narrow, it sounds regional, it sounds like another story about online fraud rings getting raided somewhere far away. But once you look closer, the scale changes completely. Cambodia's parliament has now passed a dedicated cybercrime law after months of pressure and scrutiny, and officials have said the crackdown has already shut nearly 200 scam centers, led to arrests of senior figures, and resulted in the deportation of roughly 11,000 workers. At the same time, reporting and human rights concerns have pointed to something even darker inside these compounds. Many people working there may not have been willing participants at all. That is why this story is bigger than it looks. It is not just about fake phone calls or shady text messages. It is about an industrialized fraud system hidden inside ordinary-looking buildings, backed by money, organized logistics, cross-border networks, and in some cases, forced labor. The image most people have of a scammer is outdated. They imagine one criminal with a laptop, maybe in a dark room, maybe improvising. But the modern scam economy works more like a business district built for deception. There are scripts, quotas, supervisors, translators, recruiters, payment channels, technology systems, and entire compounds dedicated to turning human manipulation into repeatable profit. That is what makes the Cambodia crackdown so important. It is not targeting a few random criminals. It is pushing against an entire underground industry that learned how to scale. These centers are not dangerous because they are clever in a cinematic way. They are dangerous because they are efficient. They take the oldest criminal instinct in the world, lying to steal, and combine it with modern data, digital communication, global payment systems, and mass targeting. Once that happens, fraud stops being a side crime. It becomes infrastructure, and that is the part many people miss. Scam centers do not just steal money. They sit at the intersection of several different crimes at once. Fraud is the obvious one. But around that fraud, there can be human trafficking, debt bondage, document confiscation, forced labor, intimidation, money laundering, and cross-border corruption. That turns the whole system into something much harder to dismantle than a normal criminal operation. If a person inside one of these compounds was recruited under false promises, moved across borders, stripped of freedom, and forced to scam strangers under threat, then this is not only a cybercrime story. It is a labor abuse story, a trafficking story, and an organized crime story all at once. That is why even the word scam can feel too small. It sounds almost petty. It sounds like something annoying and dishonest. But in this case, the deeper reality is closer to an international shadow industry. Victims exist on both ends. The obvious victims are the people losing savings, retirement money, emergency funds, and business cash to sophisticated online fraud. But there may also be hidden victims inside the machine itself. The workers trapped into carrying out fraud under coercion. Once you understand that, the story stops being about clever online tricks and starts looking more like a transnational exploitation system wearing a digital mask. The reason Cambodia matters so much in this story is geographic and strategic. Criminal systems tend to grow where enforcement is weak, money moves easily, and political or institutional blind spots allow gray zone industries to survive longer than they should. Scam centers do not need perfect secrecy. They just need enough room to operate, enough protection to keep going, and enough confusion to delay serious consequences. For years, that appears to have been enough. But once international pressure grows, sanctions expand, high-level arrests begin, and governments can no longer pretend the problem is small, the entire equation changes. That is what makes this crackdown potentially historic. Not because one country passed one law, but because the system may have finally become too visible to ignore. Once a fraud industry reaches the point where compounds are being named, routes are being traced, kingpins are being extradited, and neighboring governments are responding too, it becomes much harder to maintain the old fiction that these are isolated incidents. The world starts seeing the pattern, and once people see the pattern, the political cost of doing nothing gets much higher. But this is where the story gets even more complicated. A crackdown is not the same thing as a collapse. Organized criminal networks do not disappear just because police arrive at some buildings. They adapt, they move. They fragment, they outsource. They hide behind new companies, new fronts, new apps, new call scripts, and sometimes new countries. That means the real question is not whether Cambodia can shut down dozens or even hundreds of scam centers. The real question is whether this crackdown can damage the business model enough to make the whole industry harder to rebuild somewhere else. That is much tougher than it sounds, because the scam economy is not powered by one single office or one single gang. It is powered by flow. Flow of workers, flow of devices, flow of victim data, flow of fake identities, flow of digital channels. When those flows remain open, the industry can regrow quickly even after visible enforcement. One compound closes, another appears under a different shell company. One route becomes risky, another opens. One fraud method gets exposed, another trend replaces it. This is why so many crackdowns look dramatic in the moment but fail to fully solve the problem. The bigger risk is that the public sees raids and assumes the machine is gone, when in reality only the visible part has been hit. The hidden part may still be intact, and that hidden part is usually the most important part. The recruiters who lure workers in, the financial pipelines that move stolen money, the corrupt enablers who keep buildings available and questions away, the higher-level organizers who rarely touch the victim directly and therefore stay far from the visible crime. If those layers survive, the system can mutate rather than die. That is why laws matter here. A dedicated anti-scam law changes more than punishment. It changes how the state can describe the problem, target the networks around it, and prosecute the people who make the system possible. It signals that authorities are no longer treating this as a vague nuisance or a public relations embarrassment. They are naming it as a defined structure of criminal activity. That matters because vague crimes are easier to deny. Specific crimes are harder to hide. Still, laws only matter if enforcement reaches the right level. Arresting low-level workers or deporting large groups may create dramatic numbers, but it does not automatically mean the core operators have been broken. In some cases, the people caught in these systems are the most disposable layer, the people easiest to replace and least able to protect themselves. That is why the deeper success of this crackdown will likely depend on whether it keeps moving upward, toward financiers, toward organizers, toward facilitators, toward the people who built the pipeline, not just the people trapped inside it. And the international part of this story cannot be ignored. Scam centers like these often do not target only one country. Their victims can be spread across Asia, Europe, North America, and beyond. Their payment systems can move through multiple jurisdictions. Their workers can be recruited from different nations. Their leadership can hide behind nationality, borders, shell companies, and legal gaps. So even if Cambodia becomes more serious than before, this remains a test of international cooperation as much as domestic enforcement. One country can disrupt the machinery. It usually takes several countries to close the roots. That is what makes this crackdown feel like more than a local law and order story. It is part of a wider moment in which governments are being forced to confront a form of crime that grew fast because it did not fit old categories neatly enough. It was digital but physical. It was financial but violent. It was borderless but rooted in real compounds. It was online but built on bodies, buildings, and intimidation in the offline world. That confusion helped it grow. The world was slower to understand what it was really looking at. Now that confusion is fading, and that may be the most important change of all, because once the public, the media, and governments begin to see scam compounds not as random dens of cybercrime but as industrial fraud sites linked to trafficking and international criminal structure, the pressure changes. The story gets harder to bury. The excuses get thinner. The tolerance gets weaker. That does not guarantee victory, but it does mean the scam economy is losing one of its most valuable assets, invisibility, and maybe that is the biggest reason this crackdown could be larger than it looks. Not because every network has been dismantled, not because the danger is over, but because the system has been dragged closer to the light. And once an industry built on deception starts becoming visible, it becomes far more vulnerable than it was before.